Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming out today. My name is David Banish. I'm a professor in the English department. I teach contemporary American literature, popular culture, and film. We're delighted to be here today because of the Fred and Lola Austin Case Writer-in-Residence program. Fred and Lola Austin Case made a very generous donation to this university, and through that ongoing endowment, we are able to bring in writers throughout the year. We have several events a year, and so we would like to acknowledge them and the great gift they gave this university. And the way that gift is going to manifest itself today is particularly special, particularly for the departments of English and the Department of Broadcasting. And that is because today, the Department of English and the entire Western Illinois University community is delighted to welcome alumna Ayana Contreras back to campus. Ayana graduated from Western in 2006. She majored in English and minored in broadcasting. And during her years at Western, she was focused on ambitious reading, honing her skills as a writer, developing the skills of a popular culture deep diver, and learning the radio business. While at Simpkins Hall, she was learning the shape of world literature and practicing creative writing. While across campus at Salee Hall, she was learning how to run a radio station and be the program director at WIU's own 88.3 The Dog. Just as important as what she was doing in class, she was also continuing to develop her lifelong practice as a record collector and an archivist of popular culture ephemera. Today, Ayana is a cultural historian, a memory worker, a radio producer, a DJ, a writer, and an artist, and an archivist. An avid collector with approaching 9,000 now. It was 8,000 in a previous draft, but I have updated information. We are on our way to 9,000 vintage vinyl records. She is the host of Reclaimed Soul, the radio program on WBEZ, and she also serves as the director of content at Vocalo Radio in Chicago. She is a columnist for Downbeat Magazine, the world's premier jazz magazine. And her writing has also been published in major magazines, both in print and online, including the Chicago Review, the Oxford American, Bandcamp Daily, and LitHub, among many others. Ayana was a 2014-15 University of Chicago and the Public Arts Life Artist in Residence. In 2017, she received the Clementine Skinner Award and the Vivian Harsh Society, and was chosen by the Association of Independents in Radio as the New Voices Scholar in 2015. So today, we are particularly excited to celebrate her new publication, her book on the post-civil rights era cultural history entitled Energy Never Dies, Afro-Optimism and Creativity in Chicago, published this past December by the University of Illinois Press. Please join me in welcoming Ayana Contreras back to campus. Ayana, thank you for being here.
Oh yeah, I mean, thank you for the invitation. I honestly haven't been here since graduation, so that's kind of far out, you know.
Well, you are returning on a note of triumph. Absolutely.
I don't owe any money.
One of the things we want to do in this talk, you'll read from your work later this evening, but listen to this list just from my introduction, right? A cultural historian, memory worker, radio producer, DJ, writer, artist, archivist. This is all of these things go coherently together the way you do them. They're very different things, and they require many different skills. And I have to say, I think for either somebody from English or somebody from broadcasting, it's kind of the dream career. Yeah. Right? Like it is. And so one of the things that we wanted to do in this talk was to think a little bit about coming from a place where it wasn't coherent yet, where you began and what those beginnings looked like right before it got coherent.
Right.
And so I'm wondering if you could take us back to maybe, I don't know how far, where the best place to start is, but maybe right before you decided to go to college.
Okay,
And where were you at that time, and what were your kind of aspirations, or what were you thinking about?
yeah. So it's interesting because now a lot of artists and creative people think of themselves as multidisciplinary. I think about this a lot. Like, when I was your age, right? Like that wasn't an idea. Like you took a path and you did a vocation, a job, like a career. Like that was what you did. And maybe on the side you might have a little, artistic endeavor, but those were like separate and never the twain shall meet. But as a young person, I was always super engaged in writing and drawing, and I was sort of an AV nut. So I had an old video camera, the type that you had to actually put on your shoulder, and audio recording equipment. And I was always, like in high school especially, super engaged in that, like as extracurricular stuff, like outside of, like we didn't have an AV program, but my friends and I, we created one because that's another level of nerdiness. Not just being involved in an AV club, creating your own AV club. So we did that. And because, we didn't have majors in high school, but I had enough credits to graduate my junior year, but I was too young at the time. So I stayed an extra year, took all my art and all English, and that was all I did for my whole senior year. So it felt like a major. It felt like I was really able to deep dive into something. And my English teachers, especially by the end, they were like, well, we know you can write. And I'm like, yeah, so can I turn in my assignment as a video project? And they're like, yeah, why not? And I'm doing like online onboard editing stuff, like rudimentary stuff. And there was no YouTube. So you had to just kind of figure it out a little bit. And so I would do that and make little, scoring it and doing voiceover and all those other
So
stuff.
was this fiction films, nonfiction films?
I did, I did a
like
documentary. Like I did one documentary, a little stop motion stuff, because I was weird. Obviously, you didn't know that.
I did not know.
Yeah,
that.
a little stop motion, little cute stuff. Just like trying to, I don't know, toy around with things. And then sort of between me, sort of initially going off to college, and then sort of deciding maybe I should slow down because I don't know where I want to go, but I know that I want to go somewhere. I wound up working full-time and just taking courses for a couple of years. And during that time, I really realized that radio, the way that I saw it, even though I'd never seen it in practice in this particular way, I knew that it would be the path for me to do all of the things that I was really interested in, except perhaps the visual art. And I was cool with the visual art being sort of like a side artistic endeavor. It didn't necessarily have to be central to my career. So then I was like, okay, so both my parents and my aunt and my uncle went to Western, and I knew that my aunt was an English major and did well here, and I knew that they had a broadcasting program. And I was like, well, if I go down there, I can just be done in a couple of years. Now, the idea, I had been an English major during this time when I was taking short courses. And I was like, there's an opportunity to perhaps change my major to radio. But I was like, that is frightening. I'm a Capricorn. So I was like, right? You feel me? So I was like, let me stick with English, right? And let me minor in broadcasting. I'd never had the opportunity to do that before. I'd never been in a school that had any sort of broadcasting program. So I minored in it, and I was like, what I'm gonna do is just like treat it like my major in all the ways I can, and either it's gonna work out or it's not. And if it doesn't work out, at least I can read and write. With the English major, it's easy to prove to people, whatever. So that was what I did. I really pushed. I just really was working really hard. I realized that there's like dorms I've never been to because I just was like, I was in Corbin, I was in Simpkins, I was in Sally, and that was it. Like all the time, like all day long.
Yeah, you were working hard while you were here as a student.
I mean, I think I took between 19 and 21 credit hours every single.
Oh my God, I didn't know that.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's crazy.
Every single time. But so I wound up being sometimes in 3 English classes at once or whatever. But that was really determined to get out in 2.5 years. because I'd already been in school. When I came down here, I was 22, you know, and that seems like not a big age difference. But if you think about some freshmen coming at 17, and I graduated high school at 17, I was like, if I'm gonna finish this, I need to just really just crunch it out, you know.
Right, because you were already where you past the point you thought you should have finished in a certain.
I mean, you know, you have this idea you're gonna graduate at 21, like that sounds about right. And so if you're already past that point, you know, I was just like, I mean, I was not in it to be getting my bachelor's at 27 years old. More power to you if that's what you're doing. But I was like, as for me, I feel like I wouldn't have had the same steam, the same passion by that point.
Right.
And if I had let myself, you know, take a light load and kind of hang out and do all kinds of stuff, I don't know that I would have been as motivated.
Right. You were really focused by the time you were here. By the time you showed up at Western, you knew what you wanted to do.
That's right.
So, but can I push you back a little before it got coherent?
Okay.
Because it's coherent by the time you get here. But I think what a lot of folks struggle with is where it gets coherent, or what that might look like, or the kind of experiences. And so I'm wondering why, like, one of the things I'm wondering is, like, were there experiences in radio? In other words, like, what were you listening to where was radio in your life before you knew, oh, that's the thing?
I felt like radio, what was magical about it for me, I wasn't familiar with public radio at all, which is ironic because I've worked in public radio now for 15 years. I wasn't familiar with it. I mean, I knew that it existed. I knew that there was a campus NPR station, but in terms of before I got here, like there wasn't any knowledge of that. When I was listening to radio, I was listening to commercial radio, and I loved that, particularly Black radio in Chicago. Those people were larger than life, but I didn't know what they looked like. And I was like, that's amazing. Like you could do that. Like you could like have this outsized personality, and sort of in some ways, some of them were really like keepers of the culture in a way that I thought was important. So there was one particular guy, Herb Kent. He hosted a show all the way until a few years ago, beginning in the late 1950s. And he was basically the institutional knowledge of sort of Black music in Chicago. And he would just tell these stories. And I remember listening in the 90s when I was still like in high school. And I thought to myself, I don't want this thing to go away. This thing that he's offering us, like this sort of, as to the point I was making before we started here, this sort of appointment listening. We're all listening to this thing together. We're all like kind of reveling in our shared culture together thing. You know, I mean, I just assumed he would retire or something. And I mean, ironically, from the point that I had started listening to him, he continued working, I think, until 2015, 16, something like that, until he passed away. He literally passed away the day after his last show. So I think I patterned the storytelling portion of my radio work from his storytelling in connection with people and, you know, DJing out in the field and, you know, that sort of thing. In terms of the rest of the work, I think it's really a product of my generation. You know, we were just saying that, like, I was born in a period that was sort of at the beginning of a lot of digital culture and at the end of a lot of material culture. You know, it was really a change in the way that people experienced culture in the world. And so, and I tell it, I mean, I keep telling the story. It feels very cinematic, but it's true. You know, you're driving through the alleys and there's stacks of records because no one wants these records. And I'm like, well, gee, these records at one point must have had value because this person clearly had 300 of them, right? So let me just go on ahead and grab them real quick. And it's not that I thought that I was going to get rich off of these records, but I thought that they had richness in them that wasn't being recognized.
Right, but that wasn't, I mean, you weren't merely in it as a collect, right, exactly. You're not it's not like investing in stocks or something, no. Right? Because you're listening to those records.
Correct.
Right, and so when you get them, so what were those listening practices like? And when did that begin? When you were listening seriously to music? When did that start?
I was always very seriously listening to music. So like as a small thing, and I talk about this a lot too, as a small thing, you're not the owner of the music around you. Do you know what I mean? You're listening to your mom's music or your big sister's music or somebody else's music. And then one day it becomes your music, right? And I don't know when that happened for you, but for me, I feel like I was like 8 or 9 and, you know, I had my little boombox on the front of my bike and my little mic for Sony, and it was my music, right? And I made my own mixtapes, and yeah. And so, you had the friends that you would chat about it with, and, you built your little knowledge base. And, it's also interesting because now there's all sorts of DJs with all sorts of gender backgrounds. But I would argue that when I started DJing, it was very unusual to have a female DJ because the assumption was that cars and music and other things were like male territory, right? I was lucky because my mother worked in a record store from the time I was very small. Now, I think maybe she stopped when I was maybe like, I don't know, 5 or 6. So it was very formative for me, the idea of women interfacing in that world and being serious. Yeah. Because she was always very serious, and all my family very serious. My grandmother, aunt, everybody, we would have debates about Harold Melvin's Blue Notes, in the basement, that sort of thing. So I was always very serious. Now, I think really being able to parse out the history of the music from how the music interfaces with the community, that was later. I don't think that happened until maybe high school, where I was like, oh, so there's a physical record, right? And that might have some metadata attached to it of the person who owned this physical record. But then there's a song on this record that was created by people, and those people have a story behind that record, right? Like how it was made or what it's really talking about or whatever. I was very interested in that. But then there's also the way in which that song functions in the community, which is a whole nother story, which is so juicy. There was a point when I was equally engaged in all of those things. And I do think that that's really
So was that when you were in high school that you started reading liner notes and
sure.
chasing down the ephemera? When did that start?
For sure, high school. But it wasn't until, probably until going to Western that I started in earnest thinking that I could contact the people. Like I could capture the stories of the community and how people were listening to the music, but I knew that the concept of the people was there. So like I was always very interested in Chicago musicians. And I remember one time in the 90s, I was at my friend, he owned a record shop. I was at his shop. He used to pay me in like pizza to watch the shop.
Do you just hang out there so much?
Just hang out at the shop. He'd be like, sit here, I'm gonna go do whatever I want to do.
This is how I got my first bookstore job. I hung out so much. He'd go, I just watch the front because I got to go around the corner, right? Like,
What are you gonna do? Smuggle the record underneath your sweater? So I was looking at like Tyrone Davis records. And I was like, wait a minute, Tyrone Davis is still around, and maybe a lot of these people are still around. Like, what if I came up to them and asked them about their thing? Like, would they talk to me? That was the piece de resistance, because that was the thing that seemed very pie in the sky.
Right, absolutely.
Like, would they talk to little old me?
Right, but they're a whole generation removed from you. Correct. At that point. So one of the really interesting questions, I think sometimes one of the things that's so remarkable to me about your career is that you really have an ear for culture in the past that to you doesn't sound like the past. Right. Do you know what I mean? Right. Like where you can, I think about young people often who you're very grounded in your own moment, and then you're trying to make a future. You're trying to go somewhere. And so you look at, most of the people that young people are listening to or that they're really obsessed with are often of their own generation, right? So if you think about top 40 or pop or whatever, it's often cycling this way. But you had this ear to reach back 20, 40 years, when you were in high school. Right. And so why didn't the past sound like the past to you? Why did that sound present? Why were you, do you think?
Right. I think that I always thought of it as being by chance that any of us were at any point, right? And I've always been into science fiction and the concept that time is actually very relative. But yeah, this concept that like, okay, so my aunt who graduated high school, not the one that went to Western, different one, went to high school and graduated in 1969. And when she married this guy named Maurice and went off to Detroit, she left her records. And so those records at my grandmother's house are like a time capsule of that moment. And I just imagine, and I know what her clothes, I mean, she left her clothes in the attic, so I would wear her clothes to school. And I think maybe there's like a level of like empathy, maybe. Like I can really connect with this because it's just like this moment, but there's some particulars that are very different, some specificities that make it unique, as opposed to sort of the Orientalism, the othering of other moments in time. Does that make sense?
It does.
He wants more.
Well, maybe it can't be explained in a certain respect, but I think that your openness to that has fueled a lot of your success. Actually,
Yeah.
This sort of ability to hear another time, to hear something that seems very far removed from you and your particular
But is it,
moment.
though? That's Americanism.
Right.
He's very American. Because it's like, okay, if you think about 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, in the march of time, that's not that long, I mean, that's not, I mean, it's a while.
It is
in pop culture
when you're
years.
15.
Maybe.
Right.
But it's not, though. I mean, if you think about it, okay, so growing up in the 80s, right, they were in a moment where the 50s were really cool. Like people were really into 57 Chevys and the color teal and whatever. And then they thought, oh, and you think about it, it's like, okay, so the 50s would have been, I don't know, 25, 30 years before this moment that we're in currently. And so it just felt as though, to borrow from Quantum Leap, there's this loop and there's like a connection between these 2 points. I guess when you're talking about the 20th century, I never think of that as being that far removed.
Right. No, I agree with you completely. I guess I'm just trying to think back to that space of adolescence, which I think in that space time. Yeah. So to me, that's fascinating. I actually think it's like part of your, like a superpower almost, that you had that insight
I
that
see what
early.
You're saying, but I was never that way.
Right.
I was able to look at people, literally look at them and see the different eras of their life. I do think it's a type of empathy where it's like, oh yeah, when they were in their 20s, I can imagine what life could have been like for them. Or, like maybe they might have had these struggles, or whatever, and it didn't feel that far away. It actually brings people together. And to the point of this book, right, I think we really hang on the 60s, 70s era that's in the book, but for every 60s, 70s excursion that's in the book, there's often like a parallel to something that's happening now, to some creative person that's engaging in something very similar now. And I purposely did that because, to your point, I guess not everybody can really pat their head and rub their tummy in that way.
Yeah, no, I think that's a problem. I think you're right. That's particularly a problem in American culture, which I think is driven by this incessant consumerist, the new.
Right.
And even while people are recycling various things in order to create the new in one way or another, right? That there's almost sort of a, I don't know, if a willed amnesia about the deeper connections and the way that what artists did, say in the 60s or the 30s or the 20s or wherever you'd like to go with it, can still have an echo and a resonance today. But you were remarkable in being able to see that early. Do you think your actual practices of the way you listened to music and read books and paid attention to the world, like what did that look like? What were those days like when you had that kind of time as an adolescent or a younger person?
I think, I was always sort of on a 2-track system, right? So I was really engaged with stuff that happened before, but then I was always very trying to stay up to date with what was happening. But what really got me excited were the parallels and the connective tissue between those 2 things. So I don't really say I was part of the hip hop generation, but when hip hop became as sample based as it did in sort of the late 80s and early 1990s, that was probably the turning point in terms of my deep interest in older music, because I would hear just a snippet of something that just captured my imagination, perhaps more than the material that I was listening to. And I'm like, what is that? And then it's like, it's the Ohio Players. I'm like, let me dig into that, right? So finding out about sort of that source material. And that's I mean, that might be the whole root of it. I'm just so interested in source material. A lot of my like finding sources and ephemeral material went from looking in the works cited of books that I really cared about and finding those original books or people or places or music or whatever, because I was always more interested in sort of the root of something than the tree.
Right. You wanted to chase it back and see what it was, the parts of that totality that are hidden, right?
Exactly.
Or the parts of that growth or whatever.
Where did it come from?
Yeah. Where did it come from? What's it rooted in? Where is it going?
There used to be like an IIT Tech or something commercial where it was like, I always like to put stuff together and take things apart. I was that person too, right?
Yeah.
So like what I didn't talk about is how many science classes I took because I was really engaged in that. And science saved me here at Western because I was horrible at math. So I took like all science classes and they couldn't figure out how I could, anyway, long story short, I've always been interested in sort of how things are made, and that's material world, that's culture, that's all of it. Like I want to know all of the ingredients of how something was made, even the things that are never spoken of.
Right.
Yeah.
So let me push you a little bit on that, just as because I want to get to the daily practice of that and what that looked like actually in terms of your in terms of your time, right?
Uh-huh.
Like, so, as when you're sort of, in your high school years or coming into college, like how much time did you actually spend just listening to records? Like how many, would you just, hours, were you doing other things or were you like concentratedly just listening? Like, what did that look like?
I don't think I was spending more time than regular people listening to music. I mean, like I was the Walkman generation. So we were like that first generation, right? That was like, didn't have to sit at home to listen to music. So I was probably listening to a lot of music, but I don't know that I was deep listening to a lot of music at that point. There was some specific stuff that really caught my ear in that moment. But I was also, I don't think that there was a moment there where I wasn't sort of reading and writing as well.
Right.
There was a lot of that.
So what did that look like?
I think most of what I was reading is very interesting because a lot of what I was reading for edification was fiction. Like that was my first love, was certainly fiction. And I thought that I would want to write fiction, but then I realized that's not what I want to do because I was so much more interested in real stories. Because what I realized was as I was writing fiction, I wrote a lot of historical fiction, not all historical fiction, but a lot of it. And so I would want to deeply research it. I wanted it to be right. So I would look up I'd have a lot of, resources of material, either old magazines that I would use. Okay, so this is the real mouthwash that somebody would have used in 1964. That's what I'm going to reference. And this is in high school, right? Or this is, what was on the radio at this point. I want to make sure that's right. But what I realized was what was actually happening was kind of a little more interesting than the stories that I was like purporting to try and make up and tell.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So one of the things that brings up, you're starting to read the magazines of the past. Was this when you were starting to read things like Ebony and Jet and Life and Look and all that?
Oh my
so
God.
Go back and all that.
Bananas. It was definitely a lifestyle choice. Yeah. It was fascinating because I do think that, you can read a great, historical book, like a book that's written from a historical reference. Like I want to tell this history of Martin Luther King Jr., right? It's another thing to read something that came out the week he died and really give that perspective. I was always very interested in sort of immediate culture that was sort of made to be thrown away and what it says about culture.
Right. So like when you're reading the story about Martin Luther King or you're reading in Life or Ebony or whatever it is, and you're also seeing all of the ads, you're seeing everything else, you're getting the whole feeling of the time.
Right.
And then especially with those magazines, which you write a lot about in the book, one of the things that's happening there, those big oversized photojournalist based magazines, they're beautiful. So if you get obsessed with that, and here's a question, we've talked about this a little, I think a danger for a lot of people that get obsessed with that kind of thing is one can easily fall into a kind of naive nostalgia, which is to say, I think when I was growing up, and particularly in high school, and I think this is pretty typical of Generation X, it seemed like, whatever had really happened had happened in 1968. And, now we're stuck in the late 80s or early 90s, and there's nothing, the youth culture in this, and there's not that much happening in the same way. And there was a lot of nostalgia amongst a lot of people I knew.
I mean, clear Pepsi, though.
Yeah.
It was amazing.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. No. So, I'm tempted to hang on to that and do something with it. I'm going to let it go. So how did you avoid the trap of nostalgia? Or why wasn't that a temptation for you?
I guess I just always imagined it as being parallel in the sense that I just saw the good and the bad in all of it all at once. And it actually bothers me. I've always enjoyed sort of historical, fictional films and TV shows. It's always been my jam. But it bothered me when it was trying to come up with sort of a Pollyanna-ish view of any time period, because I'm like, that doesn't even ring true to me, And also, you make the point that these magazines have a lot of breadth and depth to them, right? Like, so magazines, sometimes they're aspirational, in their editorial viewpoint, but often they tell a pretty wide swath of experience, especially one such as Life or Ebony or Jet. So you're going to see the good and the bad. And the other thing that really struck me so much was sort of looking at these things from the lens of the moment and of that I was currently in, and looking at the progress, especially with Ebony and Jet, because it's like when, hindsight is 2020. And so you're looking at an Ebony from 1967, and it's talking about, Blacks in TV. It's like, and this was it's like Julia and I Spy, and that's kind of it. But like thinking about what it was like for me, like in the early 90s, there's all kinds of shows. And now it's much more than that, right? So it was interesting to sort of, there was that aspect of it. There was definitely a hindsight aspect of it, but it wasn't like, these were the good old days.
Yeah.
I couldn't, that didn't ring true to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So as you're coming through high school and you're starting out doing college courses, a lot of stuff is already consolidated for you in terms of you say the radio there, but what did you imagine that to be before you did it? Like what were you thinking that career was going to look like?
I mean, the only thing that I had seen that was a thing, there was like talk radio, right? And then there was Venus Flytrap, I'm going to drop a record and wax poetic about said record and maybe have a guest on and talk about the record. I didn't really know that there was anything else. So like one of the things that I'm known for is very intentional audio production that I didn't think was a thing. Like I didn't realize that people did that. And now with podcasting, like more and more people are privy to that, but that wasn't for most daily driving radio shows. There wasn't like heavy editing, I mean, in coming to college and learning Cool Edit Pro, throwback, right? Yes. So learning about that, which is now Adobe Audition, but yeah, learning about that was kind of very interesting to me because my only reference point to that level of editing was film.
Yeah.
So the way that I edit is really based on formative films that I heard that had really beautiful sound design and scoring, so.
Fantastic. Right. So that's just fantastic because basically it's sort of like already. So, but you're oriented towards your ear. You really have this developed sensibility even when you're about film. So when you get to Western then and you start working in radio, what was that like?
Oh man, it was cool because there was a lot of people who were radio nerds such as myself who had gotten into it because they got the bug and they thought that it was sort of this sort of, I don't want to say romantic, but there's so much pop culture around radio and radio stations, or at least there has historically been. There's like the pump up the volume concept, there's WKRP concept, and all of that was super fascinating. And I just wanted to figure out if I had a place there, And I still have friends to this day that I met in broadcasting here. Yeah, very serious. Everybody I met was really serious. in that department. Nobody was playing games with broadcasting, especially sports broadcasting. Jesus, Mary and Joseph, those people were super intense, man.
Absolutely. Right. But their career was sort of waiting. If they could succeed at that, the career path for that was sort of waiting for them. Your career was a little more open in a way.
I mean, to a certain extent, but I would also argue that, I mean, it was also a moment when HD radio had just launched, but a lot of stations were sort of consolidating and voice tracking, and the jobs were starting to shrink.
Right.
So it was frightening,
Yeah.
too. Like the prospect of, are you going to even get a job,
Right.
was definitely looming large over people. So there's that aspect of it. I mean, part of the reason why I didn't want to switch to major in broadcasting, even though I knew I wanted to engage in radio, was because broadcast communication seemed to me to be a vocational degree in the best possible way. Like you learn all of the skills, all of those classes, everything I learned, I had a deep advantage over the people who went to J school that wound up at my station because I knew how to make the sausage. And I knew why the sausage was important, and I knew about cume, and I knew about all of the things. So I mean, I'm not trying to hierarchically say one is more important than the other, but I do think it's a different thing than with, I guess I was English literature as opposed to English ed. And English literature, you come out like, what the hell are you supposed to do with that? Like, I mean, there's concepts, but there isn't like a path to your
right. This is I often give the example of folks that do English or do history or do philosophy or do these kinds of things. That on the one hand, you develop these really, really intense skills, right? Like you're a really intense reader, you're a really intense writer. But out of that, you have to invent a life, which often means exactly the kind of stuff that you're talking about that you picked up in your minor. Like you have to learn a suite of software in order to produce radio, or you have to, if you go into the world of film, you have to learn how to edit, you have to learn how to run a camera, whatever it may be. And so, folks in the humanities, although they have the advantage, as you do, is that, reading and writing in themselves and doing it at a very, very sophisticated level, that itself will take you far in the world. But you have that challenge of you have to invent what kind of that's going to be in some way. And that's often a challenge.
Right. If you can see what I was able to do that maybe you don't learn in broadcast communications is a close reading of a song.
Yeah.
Because that's not like what it is. Like it's a lot of things, but it's not necessarily that. It's not necessarily the ability to apply some of the things that we learn as English majors into my broadcasting practice, if that makes sense.
It does. Yeah.
Yeah. But I could crossfade like nobody's business. You know what I'm saying? Because that wouldn't be something that I would have learned if I had just been an English major necessarily. So. Right.
Absolutely. And then so when you're here and you were working in radio, you actually became program director. So did you have a show? And then tell us about that. What happened?
So I started out with a show. It was interesting because the show started out being sort of the music that hip hop was built on and current sort of urban alternative stuff. And then what I realized was like the people who were listening were really more interested in the throwback music because they couldn't get it anywhere else at that point. You couldn't get it on a Spotify playlist. I don't even think YouTube really had music on there like that. And they missed that music from their home, I think was really what it came down to. And so I'm like, well, I'm gonna do the community a solid. I'm gonna just stick with the old school. And it became the old school show, right? And then there became opportunities to be, I think, program director. And at that point, I don't know if this has changed, but they really didn't want non-majors to be like program director, right? So I was the urban program director, and when I like my senior year, and then there was a girl who was music director, and I think she graduated early or something, and so I became urban music program, and that was scandalous back then. But also I knew that if I didn't do that, if I didn't have that little feather, that I would be less competitive from all the people who had majored, in the world. And I wanted to show somehow on my resume that I was serious about it.
Right. Yeah, I often talk to students about this. One of the things that we developed in English is we have what I consider the Vanity Fair of the English department, which is a department magazine called The Mirror and the Lamp. And the students that have gone on to take on the managing editor positions and have really guided it through. And then they learn InDesign, they learn about editing, they go through the whole thing, the Adobe stuff, the Photoshop. They learn all that stuff as they go through there. And then when they go out on job interviews, they've already done it, right? Like they can check those boxes. So they have all of the more sort of open-ended, deep skills that you're talking about. But on the other hand, they're actualizing that by actually doing things on the ground that are preparing them in some way to enter the world of producing culture in one way or another. And your example of that is just so powerful in that way. Yeah. Did you feel overwhelmed when you were taking that all that on? You're doing 18 or 19 hours. You're running a radio show. You're program directing. You must have been just living on coffee. What was happening?
Yeah, basically. I remember one time I was in the computer lab and some paper, probably for you, just like got deleted. And I was like, it all kind of came to a head. I was like, what am I doing with my whole entire life? But I rallied and rewrote the paper. Probably got a B. And I think the ability to work on a crunch is actually a good skill to have, and stay like true to it, as opposed to just sort of like, writing it in, like just doing the very bare minimum. Because I don't think that I was ever, you didn't know that I was like,
no.
Yeah. He just knew that I was there. I was there. Yeah. I was 100% present.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. You were top of the tops in English and just writing brilliantly.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, that was the key. I guess I didn't think that much about
but at that time, I did not know that you were program director of a radio station.
I'm also program director now. Yeah. So that set me up well. But that was also like something I always wanted to do. So it was pure pleasure to, pick out the music, work on the interstitials, and like harass people who were not, doing what they were supposed to be doing on air, and all of the things. It is time consuming, yes, but very pleasurable.
But while you were doing that, you were still committed to reading and to writing and to doing these other things.
It was hard. I don't think that I was doing as much pleasure reading.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
I think there was a moment, I think it was probably about 6 months after I graduated, where I didn't read a thing, like nothing. Maybe the back of like a bottle, but I was not reading. Yeah. And then I came back. But because I was just reading so much. And part of the reason why I was so attracted to your courses and to Shazia's courses were that you were introducing me to books that I actually wanted to read. So you kept me going. I wasn't just reading stuff to read stuff. You were introducing ideas that I could immediately plug in and apply to the worldview, to your point, that I had already been building.
Right. So I think, as students are watching this, I think that, to me what this shows is that I think there are a lot of students that haven't quite made it all coherent yet. Yeah. And they've got interests, and they're not the kind of interests that lead them into a straight vocational career, right? Yeah. If you major in accounting, you kind of know what's going to happen to you. You're going to fall backwards off the stage, and the guy in the suit's going to catch you, and they're going to whisk you off to a cubicle and put you in front of a spreadsheet. Yeah, and that's great, and that's a great career, and they'll do very, very well. But they don't have to spend a lot of time sort of thinking about like, oh my God, how am I going to fit in to a world of culture where the doorways into that world are not so clear. And so you did that so brilliantly. You were able to take these various interests, make them coherent, and then create two sides to it, right? Mm-hmm. One, which is this sort of just very open-ended, deep intellectual side. You're talking about like close reading, songs, and that. So sort of taking what we're doing with novels and poetry and music and all this, and you apply that, which is very open-ended in the end. It's very difficult to get paid for, right? Very few people make a living out of that. But you're also at the same time developing really practical skills on the radio, and you're putting that all together in a way that is going to allow you to enter into that world of culture and find a place in the production of it.
Right. So I think, my job didn't exist before me. It didn't. What I do, like the way that I do what I do, the combination of things that I do didn't exist. And so being in the right place at the right time at the genesis of a few different positions and projects was to my advantage. So there's that, right?
Right. This is everybody. Every time the successful people, right? You always say they always say a little good luck in the timing
And being prepared.
Yeah.
Right. So when I landed at WBEZ, there was no Vocalo, quote unquote. And so I don't know that there was a place for me there. Like they made an internship up for me at Chicago Public Radio because the internship coordinator saw my resume, saw that I was working at the Dog, that I was program director, and it's like, oh, this is impressive. This kid really, got a little, we're going to make an internship. Now, it wasn't paid, so don't get too excited. But, it was a foot in the door. And then they created this Vocalo project, which was supposed to be like remixing public radio for like a younger, more diverse audience. And I was younger and theoretically diverse. So I was in a great place and I had ideas. So I was able to incubate those ideas. And I'll say all day long, a lot of people know me for DJing in the community in Chicago and for writing, for different whatever. Radio has been, I don't want to call it a cash cow, but radio has kept me in, I don't know, cowboy boots and, you know what I'm saying? Like it has been it's done me well. It's allowed me to get into like a lot of people's doors and ask them questions. So it's really given me the material for a lot of my writing. But then it's also like helped me build just relationships with generations of creative people.
Right, because you interview many of the stories you tell in the book come out of it, and you quote extensively from the interviews that you did over many years as part of Reclaim Soul and other programs that you were working on at Vocalo and WBEZ.
Right. Yeah. So those were all 100% skills from broadcasting that I was able to apply to that. And they're high quality waveforms. Like they exist somewhere in a high quality wave format, which if I had been, radio, I don't know, they might've been on like a dictaphone or something, but I think I didn't let either of those sensibilities go. The love of the sound and of the broadcast has always been really central to my work, but I've always also been very engaged with writing. And really for broadcasting, you're also writing a lot. Yeah. If you're doing it right, even if you don't necessarily put it on the page, you are composing at all times in order to communicate well.
Yeah, and editing in every sense.
Oh, for sure. All of the editing. Yeah. That was the thing, writing this book. I was just telling some people the other day, writing this book, I had to reverse engineer my writing style because, I learned a certain writing style with y'all, and then I had to work radio. And that was not going to work on air because one thought per sentence, man. Like, keep it clear, concise, no semicolons. So when I went to write for the book, they were like, why are you writing like this? I'm like, I don't understand what you're saying. It's like, I can't, they couldn't, the editors at the university press couldn't really conceptualize what was so different. And it wasn't even that I was using small words or anything like that, because I think it's got a pretty robust vocabulary. But generally speaking, the sentences were so much shorter. And part of the reason why in broadcasting they're so short is the concept that you assume that people have one time to hear it. They might now even scrub back and listen to something twice. But back then, the assumption is you have one chance to listen. And most of the time when people are listening to the radio, they're doing something else as well. So you need to write it in the clearest possible way.
Yeah. And that aesthetic goes all the way back through through newspaper and all of it, the whole history of journalism. Yeah. Absolutely.
In high school, for me, I thought a lot about Hemingway versus Fitzgerald, and my spirit was Fitzgerald. But then I realized I'm living Hemingway. Like that's really like the way that I write now and my style of life. It's like Hemingway with a smattering of. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, like in the book, the book has that clarity, and then there will be this wonderful moment of lyricism that comes for emphasis at various points.
Just a little.
Yeah, well, more than a little. The end in particular is beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
But we'll get to that. So you didn't plan to end up in public radio. That was
no,
and you. you didn't have a relationship to public
Not at
radio
all.
before. So tell us a little bit about how you got that internship in public radio, and then what surprised you, and how that world sort of enabled some of what you do. You've talked a little bit about it, but maybe.
It was super far out because, like I said, coming from, the Dog, which is patterned after a commercial radio station, the idea that there would be a radio station, first off, it's nonprofit, and then it is all about sort of news and information and context. That was far out, but cool. Like, I'm like, this is great. It's like Channel 11, but on the radio. I love it. Like PBS, we'll say. But for the radio, I love it. And so I was immediately interested conceptually in it. And my first internship, this was something that was, again, they made it up. So it was something called Sonic IDs. So what they did was they gave us a Marantz solid state recorder. Oh yeah, and a beautiful Sennheiser. And they sent us out in the streets, and it was me. But it became an internship after me. And I recorded soundscapes, like beautiful, high fidelity soundscapes all over the city that were idiosyncratic in their own way. And then they would become station IDs. Like, would be like, you're listening to WBZ, Chicago Public Radio, 91.5 FM. And I kind of got into it, and some of them I had them become almost like skits, vignettes. Like one of them was recorded at a counter at a jeweler's mall, and it was like two Russians. And I had them say Chicago Public Media in Russian. And so they come up with this whole, how do you say it? And then they started saying it, and like that's the whole skit, like them trying to figure out how to translate it. It's very funny. But yeah, I mean, it was a very fun, like, drop into thinking about sound outside of music.
But music had prepared you, like you were
to
prepared and to listen in that way. So so that long daily practice that you were, that was a whole part of your life. That was an integral part of your life, which you can't know that that's all going to become the thing that will suddenly allow this kind of this kind of thing. But then it is the thing that makes it and does it.
Yeah, I mean, when I was initially hired at WBEZ, I was an anchor, right? Like an overnight anchor. So I wasn't really doing music stuff at first. And then Vocalo happened. And even with Vocalo, there was only so much. They didn't want it to be a music station, so there's only so much I could do. But every inch that I could, I tried to do. And so I, got some interviews and interviewed. Did I tell you the story about oh, okay, this is a funny one. So like back in the day when you Googled a person, if their number was in the phone book, their number would come up on the right-hand column, and there'd be maybe like a little phone emoji type thing. And so like I looked up Marshall Chess, who's like the son of Leonard and Phil, or specifically Leonard Chess of Chess Records, like this venerable blues label out of Chicago. And I was really interested in sort of his backstory because I had already been really studying that particular label. And I was like, I would love to interview him. And so I called the number, and phone picks up, and it's like, Marshall, honey, it's a telephone. I'm like, oh my God, this is this man's house. Like, I just didn't think it was his house. And so, we talked for a minute, like, well, let's schedule something. Let me not do this now, but I'm calling from Chicago, and I wanted to ask you about Rotary Connection, which is not something he's asked much about. He started the Rolling Stone record label for Rolling Stones, the group, and he did a whole bunch of other things that he's much more known for, but I knew this was really close to his heart, this thing I wanted to ask him about. So I was like, this is my big chance. And so we spent, I don't know, like 40 minutes just like kind of chatting about it. And that was probably one of my first big interviews in terms of somebody that was really sort of pivotal to the world that I was curious about of the past. Yeah. But I knew that coming from WBZ in Chicago held some gravitas. And especially if I'm talking about Chicago, that would be something that would get me in some doors. But also what would help me is that I intimately knew these people's, not just careers, but their life's work, the thing that really is near and dear to their heart. When I'm interviewing a lot of these people, they are very undersung. Right? Like, and so just to have somebody come to them and really not be like fangirling out, but just like, oh man, when you put out this record in 1972, like, how are you feeling? Because it sounds like, and they're like, how did you, this is, like.
Right, you knew the work. You had listened to it. You had thought about it. You were prepared.
I was very connected
Yeah.
to the work.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very much what Peter Bogdanovich did in a previous generation, when Bogdanovich, sort of nobody was paying attention to the Hollywood studio directors of the Hollywood studio era, and then Bogdanovich came around and he interviewed them. He started writing books about them and doing interviews and doing museum retrospectives and that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think there's certain people and styles of music that are generally just more sung in the days or even directly after, and other stuff less so. So like what I'm really proud about for this particular book is there's a number of people that have long form, really expansive interviews that capture them. It really captures them, and they're not with us anymore. And I don't know that those stories exist in print anywhere else for the future to experience Otis Clay, like how joyful he was about life, even though certain things didn't go the way he wanted it to. Or Reggie Torian, who, I mean, we were laughing together in the book, or, some of the other folks that, it's beautiful to be a part of that,
Absolutely. So I think we have time for audience questions. If we'd like to turn it over, if you have a question for Ayana, and then so we can do for the recording, I'll repeat your question, or I'll paraphrase it as best I can. So Everett Hamner is asking two questions here. Perhaps Octavia Butler, have you read her or dealt with her work at all, and her relationship to empathy? And then how does your project perhaps resonate with the larger project of Black Lives Matter?
I mean, I definitely have read Octavia Butler. Definitely I don't know that it really is something that I think about actively in regards to my practice. Not really. Stylistically, yes, just because how prickly she was when she was talking about things that could have been very soft and delicate. I think that was like stylistically something that I'm connecting with, because like you said, I'm not trying to handhold you and Pollyanna you with what I'm talking about, but I do believe in beauty, and what she wrote, she wrote beautifully. I think that was what I was more connected to with her. And, just sort of the malleability of time, that's not really addressing your particular point with the empathy, but I think because I read her as such a young person initially, the malleability of time was something that I connected with. I mean, real talk, this is going to be a Gen X throwback. One of my favorite shows was Quantum Leap. Oh my goodness, I loved that show. Just the concept that, that's actually really about empathy at the end of the day, because it's like he's dropping into all of these other people, in order to, whatever, save the world or whatever. But like conceptually speaking, what it represents is that we're shells, in a way. And it's sort of by chance that we're in any one body. But to speak to the Black Lives Matter point, we're not shells. We are specifically in a space for a reason. So I don't know if I've really grappled with that. But I do think in terms of equity, I talk about a lot of creative projects, both fine arts and popular art, and a lot about lack of equity and intellectual property in terms of Black creation in this particular book. I don't have any answers, mainly because I do think that intellectual property, like questions of intellectual property and monetization, I keep saying that, I really do think that's like one of the biggest cultural issues of our time today. I over and over again, so many people, just because we have all the platforms of creation, doesn't mean we've even sussed out the issues, the same issues that caused problems in the recording industry in the 1950s when people got paid a hot dog to have like a million selling record. Like I think it's the same thing on TikTok right now. So Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think a lot about that. The actual value of these things versus the value that these folks have gotten out of it, who were the creators of these things.
Absolutely.
And who did get the value.
Yeah.
I mean, one of my least favorite things to do, and this is something that I learned about a lot in broadcasting, is to follow the music. So thinking about, you know, a lot of these old labels, you can play the game with almost any of the old labels, the old record labels. Follow the music to who owns what. And at this point, I think maybe there's 3 major companies that own more than 75% of the recorded music of all of recorded music history. It used to be 4 or 5, but they've consolidated since then. That's wild. That's actually wild.
Well, or frightening in a.
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, you know, depends on how you look at it. But either way, I mean, it's not, oof,
Yeah.
Yikes.
Yeah.
And those are the people who are getting the shares. So we're talking a lot about Spotify, right? And it's like, well, who's really benefiting from Spotify?
Yeah.
Because these people who made these songs that are getting half cent, they are not the ones who are actually profiting off of this whole model.
Yeah, they have to tour relentlessly to keep them
and sell
together.
merch. That's part of the reason why it's a good thing vinyl is back.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people who don't even play records buy a record to put in the shelf just to kind of say they support somebody.
Yeah.
I'm not mad at it.
Yeah. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Would you say it's more important to be class conscious or race conscious in this current era of strife and with turbulence? And obviously you can be both. I'm sort of curious, which do you value more?
So I think the question is about the relationship of class consciousness and race consciousness in the contemporary moment.
That's a great question. I like that in you. So I think it's hard because race is so central to everything, and there are so many folks who think that race and class are sort of monolithic in the sense that Black people are in an underclass in the fact of their Blackness. I don't necessarily agree with that wholesalely. I also think that, cracking the nut of capitalism, I don't think that will inoculate you from the problems of racial oppression in America. So there's that, I remember when I was in school, we're all like, class is the new race, and it's gonna be, you know what I'm saying? Not to say that we didn't see color or we didn't think about race as being a problem, like racial oppression, I should say, as being a problem. I think the thought was that let's complicate it by adding in class, because really there's so much more in common with folks who are in a quote unquote lower class, regardless of color right now, the way that, I think this was before we were talking about the 99%. But it was that concept was starting to become sort of the lexicon of a lot of folks. It's so hard. I do think that because there's so much progress left to be done, and we'll just narrow it down to the Black community, I think we do ourselves a disservice when we try and stratify ourselves out by class. The only way that Black people made a lot of the moves that they did in the 20th century was that folks felt collectively engaged, regardless of their station, to uplift the people as a whole. So maybe the answer for me would be race first and then class. But that's assuming that everybody's on that page where they don't think that they're inoculated from those other people's problems.
So one of the things that's remarkable in the book that I was struck by is the wide range of people that you interview. And I think, because I read a lot of music criticism and the history of music and this, and it's often really focused on the musicians, or then sometimes it'll branch out and you'll get the people at the record labels or an agent or somebody like this that will then tell the story of how this band or how this music came to be, right? Yeah. But in your book, you're connecting those people and those stories with a lot of the business people, both big and small, in the community, which I often think, from especially people from a super leftist academic point of view or whatever, you often want to set up capital as like, that's the thing to be resisted or to be worried about.
Yeah.
But in your book, a lot of those people are really playing sort of heroic roles,
That's right.
whether that's the owner of a small food stand, or whether that's who's connecting various people, or whether that's the owner of a record store that's in the community that's really supporting the community and musicians and other people, or it's like the Johnson family or something like this that's
Right.
building a multinational global
Right.
corporation.
Right. Yeah, I have this conversation a lot. There's a lot of young people who are like, down with capitalism. Capitalism is the worst thing that ever happened. I'm like, okay, well, let's look at the civil rights movement real quick, because who was funding it? But a lot of small business folks, a lot of business entities. I don't think that the concept of the exchange of goods and services for cash is a bad thing per se. What's a bad thing is if your morals are out of whack and you are not engaged with, like I said, the upliftment of the people in your community. And that is not that's not your goal in life. I mean, people want to make money. Okay, fine. That's fair. You're a human being. But if you also understand you have an opportunity to give people a shake at life, and you have the opportunity to invest in your community in ways that make everybody's life better, I think that is an equitable way to look at quote unquote capitalism, And I'm much more interested in the ecosystem of artistic creation than I am in just the person who wrote the song place. Like, so I am interested in the guy who owned a barbecue shack and put a guy through conservatory because he thought that was not only a good business endeavor, but he thought that guy was talented.
Yeah.
Like, he's gonna do that. Like, that's just another way in which he can, put his money where his mouth is.
Right.
I'm very interested in that story.
Yeah. So your book, I think it answered the question. In part, you answer that question in the book, right? Because as much as the book is definitely about the experience of Black Chicago, it's an experience not just of Black Chicago musicians or creative folks,
Right.
but it's actually the people that are running mom and pop businesses that are
And
interacting with
yeah.
those creative folks, and then the big, and that's a fascinating way to tell that story at a huge kind of holistic level.
At the end of the day, the book is not a book about music. It's the book about sort of belief in the improbable, right? Like, that's what the book is about. And that creative energy never dies.
Yeah.
And that it is applicable to different generations and spaces and realities. So, like, if we're talking about what these improbable dreams are, maybe it's Earth, Wind, and Fire. That's ridiculous. How did this happen, right? Or maybe it's a hair care firm that literally crossed the globe and changed the way people thought about, afros, right? Like, maybe it's that. Or maybe it's Soul Train. All of those two things are definitely 100% business endeavors, but, they also have cultural impact. So, like, I weighed those equally. I'm going to talk about all of those things. And then I'm also going to talk about this other person who maybe was never a big star, but somehow synthesized a moment in a really interesting way as well.
Other questions?
I've got another one. I'm teaching a class right now that is about hope and despair and how dangerous both can be in their extreme forms, when they become kind of vapid, cruel hope or cruel despair, and how we need courage, period, determination, period, regardless, whatever we're facing. And I'm really interested in the term you used in your subtitle, Afro-optimism. What is uniquely African-American about the optimism that you're offering and cultivating? And what's translatable to white Americans, Latinx Americans,
I can't answer what's translatable,
Okay.
but I can talk about what's unique about it.
For
Go
the
ahead.
purposes of the recording, I think the question is about the possibilities of and dangers of extreme hope or extreme despair, and if you could comment on your concept of Afro-optimism that's in
Correct.
your subtitle.
So, okay, let's say that you are in a country, not by will, if your people are enslaved, and then you like make it out of slavery, and then you go through Reconstruction, and then you go through Jim Crow, and you go through all of these other things, right? Like the idea that you could become Diane Carroll, right? The idea that you could become a titan of hair care industry, right? Like that is something that will give you hope, even though everything around you is telling you that you are less than, right? So I think Afro-optimism is optimism despite whatever's in front of you. And that is sort of the way that I know have seen things, right? Like despite what they're telling you, you know in your heart that something is possible because you've seen it before. And maybe if you follow that thing past its natural conclusion that they would normally end it at in the biopic of it, right? Like it might have gone down like Ebony Jet, right? The building might have become condos. But guess what? In 1972, shoot, on top of the world, unbelievable. Yeah, so I think it's sort of a non-Pollyannish approach to belief in the improbable, rooted in a concept of self-determination. Yeah, and to your point about sort of hope versus despair, there is conversely in the academy this phrase called Afro-pessimism that's been floating around, and basically it assumes that Black people in the United States of America specifically, I can speak on, are doomed by the fact of our Blackness, which every time I heard that term, like, I just wanted to strangle somebody, and I needed a way to use the language to articulate why. And so this book basically is a treatise to say that not only do I think that the whole concept of Afro-pessimism is ridiculous, I think that, or at least to stay in that space, we'll say. But I think that conversely, what I actually believe is Afro-optimism based on the exact same things in front of me. Like what I see is this. What I see when I see someone who has the audacity to be an Afro-pessimist is somebody who on the hierarchy of needs has the luxury to be a pessimist based on their situation right now. I'm like, okay, so look at you. You're earning your PhD at Berkeley, we'll say. And you are an Afro-pessimist. And I'm saying, have you asked your ancestors whether looking at your personal story, even if you have experienced oppression and denial and microaggressions and all of that, have you looked at what your story says about the struggles that they went through? You know, like I think that is really the gist of what bothers me about that term, you know. And it's not to say that there aren't problems, right? Like obviously there's some real serious problems in the United States of America in the year of our Lord 2022. But at the same time, looking at the crush of history, right? Like where we were 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 80 years ago, 100 years ago. Again, that wasn't that long ago. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, we have made it really far. My God. And we have so far to go, but we can do it. It could happen. It could happen.
Right. And in the book, the argument, right, is that the energy of those past moments, right, is still available.
Correct.
If you have the ears to hear it.
That's right. And ultimately, the it can happen is really weighing on to your question. It's not up to any one of us. It's up to the collective, because that's the only way that enough of that energy is going to really make that change. Because if it's up to us all individually, I mean, we all have to put in our bit, right? But it's like, and I would actually argue, it's not just up to all of Black people, right? It's not just up to all of brown people. It's up to every person to be actively engaged in the progress of this society for there to be progress in this society. I mean, when we were we were small things. Oh, all those races are gonna die out. That's not what happened. Racism doesn't die. That's not how that happens. None of it dies. It just multiplies. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Yes.
Thank you for that.
I was just wondering, I know it sounds like you've been surrounded by music your whole life and you do these close readings with the music. I was wondering if you have a favorite album or artist that you like to put on?
So the question is that you spent your life surrounded by music, developing your ear, listening. Do you have a favorite album or artist that you return to?
I know it's totally situational because if you had 9,000 records and you're only listening to one artist, you're not doing it right. But what I would say is that probably top 10, I'm not going to name all 10, but in the top 10 would include definitely Marvin Gaye, definitely Curtis Mayfield, more and more Aretha as I age. Yeah, those are probably, and Donny Hathaway, 100%. I mean, Donny Hathaway out of all of those three has the smallest recorded history, but it's so rich and interesting. And if you ever get a chance to actually read any of his writings about music, it's actually also extremely fascinating from a music theory level.
Yeah, you got me listening to a lot of these things as I was reading the book. So as I was reading the book, I was calling out many of the songs, and people like I didn't know about Rotary Connection. I was listening to Rotary Connection
It's far
as
out,
it
right?
went. It was really far out. Oh my! And their whole presentation, the way they presented themselves, the whole thing.
Did you see
Just-
any of the YouTube videos?
Yeah, that's
right?
exactly what I pulled up. Yeah, that's
So
my go-to
good.
when I'm sort of discovering stuff like this. So yeah, while I was reading your book, I had the soundtrack out and a lot of Donny Hathaway. And yeah, so I'd encourage anybody as you read Ayana's book, it comes with a soundtrack. And we're talking about all the downsides of vinyl or MP3, but the really great thing is that things are available to discover in a way that they maybe were not so easily discoverable in the past, and so you can make some of that available.
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting. Like Rotary Connection, I know probably most people in this room have no idea, but Rotary Connection was the original group that Minnie Riperton, the one who sang Loving You, the very high-pitched song that people have heard on Burger King commercials or what have you. But before she was in that group, or before she sang solo, she was in this weird rock soul fusion-y group, and it was super far out, and they performed with like Led Zeppelin, and it just all kinds of it was just so cool. And it was one of the very first interracial bands too. So like Sly and the Family Stone or something like that, kind of in that category of things, but came straight out of Chicago and really spoke to that moment in time there in a cool way.
Absolutely. Ayana, on behalf of the whole WIU community, I would like to thank you for coming back to campus. I'd like to congratulate you on your amazing career and on the new book, which I would encourage everyone to read. It is an amazing, amazing book. I've learned a lot reading it. And we hope that you will come back to campus soon again.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.